Hey everyone, Rolandell here again today. It's December 7th, 2011, and 70 years ago today was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which happened about 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning when all the troops were sleeping in, the ones that were still there on the vessels. And of course, nobody could believe that the Japanese were indeed attacking and bombing in the horrific way that they did. Now, I'm not an expert on Pearl Harbor, but I was stationed there, starting off in the Coast Guard in Honolulu back in the 80s. And I had the opportunity to sit in a pub with some of the sailors and soldiers that were there. And of course, they told me all about it and the horrific events they saw. And they also told me that strange things occurred, like they had ammunition sitting up on the decks, this type of thing. Like perhaps somebody expected something, but I don't know, because I'm really not a conspiracy theory type of guy. But I can only relay to you what these different veterans told me from the airfields, the Hickam Airfield, and of course in Pearl Harbor itself. And I noticed that most of the veterans that fought in World War II got out. They were still very, very bitter and hurt towards the Japanese, which I can certainly understand. But the ones that stayed in, there was a career officer stayed in. He was okay with it. I guess he had time to adjust in his life to realizing that the Japanese are not the only enemy in the world. Now, as far as the Coast Guard, I was in the Coast Guard. We were at Sand Island, and the Honolulu Power Station was across from us where I was stationed, and it was the same back in 1941. However, few people realize that I believe it was a half a dozen Japanese Zero kills that the Coast Guard cutter Roger B. Taney had on that day. And of course, they got up steam and they sailed out to sea after the initial attack. They were one of the only U.S. ships that weren't caught in Pearl Harbor at that time. And it's interesting to note, and of course, I worked for a maritime museum after I got out of the Coast Guard, Baltimore Maritime Museum, and this has been substantiated, although I didn't need them to substantiate it because I heard the stories when I was overseas, stationed out of Honolulu. But the Coast Guard, Saturday night, had been drinking with the Navy, and there was a big brawl, and I imagine it was in Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure exactly where, but the CO of the Coast Guard cutter got word that there had been this, Navy Coast Guard brawl, breaking of chairs, and fisticuffs and that type of thing, and he was furious. So very early in the morning, I don't know what time, he sounded general quarters. So what happened was, when the Japanese actually attacked, the Coast Guard cutter Roger B. Taney was already at their battle stations. They were sitting on their stations the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, and that's why they were in fact able to protect the Honolulu Power Station across from Sand Island. And not very many people know this, but that's exactly why it occurred. And to me, that's the providence of God that things occurred that way, and they were able to get out. Now, don't ask me to explain providence of God as far as Pearl Harbor itself, because I cannot. But I can just tell you that in history, the Taney was able to steam out to sea, wasn't caught in the in Pearl Harbor because it wasn't moored there. It was moored at Sand Island facility. And then also after after I got out, I worked for the Maritime Museum, and we always, of course, celebrated Pearl Harbor. And now it's 70 years later. An interesting little note, when I got out of the Coast Guard, I moved into an apartment, and it had a picture of my mother saluting in front of the door that of the apartment that I moved into 40 years later, which is rather interesting. And of course, we got the Roger B. Taney at the Baltimore Maritime Museum also when I worked there. So it's some interesting little footnotes, but I just wanted Americans to realize the great sacrifice that has always been put forth on behalf of our freedoms and behalf of protecting the interests of the United States that men and women have made through the generations, and it should not be taken lightly. Too many people, I feel today, because they don't have a mandatory draft, mandatory service of any kind in this country, take these things for granted. But I can tell you that the scars in the men the day I talked to when I was 20 years old in Pearl Harbor were still very, very much there. And of course, I had a cousin who I looked more at as an uncle, who was in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, all the major battles, and he too had was very had survivor's guilt and was very, very wounded emotionally because of that. But certain things are worth the cost, and these veterans considered what they did worth the cost in protecting the United States as a nation for their families and for generations to come. And I think that we should all realize that and show honor to these people whenever possible. God bless you. Bye-bye.